heartbeat of humanity. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. Ethan Carter always believed in control. In his world, everything was precise, from his business dealings to his personal life. Every decision he made was calculated, weighed against the possible risks, and every outcome he anticipated was within his realm of influence. He was a man who never left things to chance. That is, until the night Sophia collapsed. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when they left the small cafe on the edge of the city. It had been a quiet evening, a rare moment of calm in their otherwise hectic lives. Sophia had laughed at something silly, Ethan said, her eyes sparkling with the joy that always seemed to come so naturally to her. Even though she was 6 months pregnant, she still carried herself with the same grace and ease that had captivated him from the moment they met. They were just a few blocks from their car when Sophia suddenly stopped, clutching her side with a sharp intake of breath. Her face twisted in pain, and Ethan was by her side in an instant, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sophia?" His voice was tight with concern. She tried to wave him off, her hand trembling slightly. "It's nothing. Probably just the baby kicking a little harder than usual." But it was more than that. Ethan could see the way her body tensed, the way her skin paled beneath the streetlights. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Before he could react, Sophia's knees buckled, and she collapsed into his arms, unconscious. "Help!" Ethan shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet street. His heart raced as panic flooded his veins. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. The ambulance ride was a blur. Ethan sat frozen beside Sophia's still form, the world outside the windows nothing but streaks of light and color. The paramedics worked quickly, their voices calm but urgent as they monitored her vitals and checked for signs of distress. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence, each sound reminding Ethan of how fragile life really was. He reached for Sophia's hand, holding it tightly in his own. She was so pale, her breath shallow and uneven. A wave of fear unlike anything he had ever known washed over him. This was supposed to be the happiest time of their lives. They were going to be parents, a new chapter in their story just beginning. But now, all of that feels as though it was slipping away. "What's happening to her?" Ethan demanded. His voice edged with desperation. One of the paramedics glanced at him briefly, her face set in a mask of professional detachment. "We don't know yet. We're taking her to St. Andrews. It's the best hospital in the city. They'll take care of her." But that wasn't enough for Ethan. He needed answers, needed to understand why the woman he loved was lying unconscious, her body limp and unresponsive. He clenched his fists, feeling the helplessness rising inside him. He had always been able to fix things, to control the outcome. But this is different. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside the emergency room entrance, the doors swinging open as paramedics rushed to unload Sophia from the vehicle. Ethan followed closely, his heart pounding with every step. The sterile, cold air of the hospital hit him as they wheeled her through the sliding doors and into the chaos of the ER. Doctors and nurses moved quickly around them, their faces focused as they tended to other patients in the packed emergency room. The sound of distant sirens, hurried footsteps, and beeping machines filled the space, creating an overwhelming cacophony that seemed to heighten Ethan's anxiety. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand, her expression professional but kind. "Mr. Carter, we're going to take your wife into the back for an examination. Please wait here. A doctor will speak with you shortly." "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice tight. "I need to be with her. She's pregnant. Something's seriously wrong. I need to know what's happening." "I understand," the nurse replied gently, "but we need to assess her condition first. We'll take good care of her. I promise. We'll keep you informed." Before Ethan could argue further, they wheeled Sophia through a set of double doors, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the chaotic waiting room. His heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. He wanted to run after her, to be by her side, but he knew that all he could do now was wait. Ethan sank into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his leg bouncing nervously as he scanned the room. Other families and patients surrounded him, some in obvious distress, others lost in their own worlds of worry. But for Ethan, everything else faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was what was happening behind those closed doors. Time moved in slow motion. Ethan sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he stared at the clock on the wall. Each tick of the second hand felt like an eternity. He checked his phone, hoping for an update, but there was nothing. No news, no word. The silence was unbearable. Every possible scenario raced through his mind, each one worse than the last. What if they couldn't save her? What if something was wrong with the baby? The thought of losing both Sophia and their unborn child was too much to bear. His chest tightened, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Just then, a nurse emerged from the double doors. Her face was neutral, professional, but Ethan could see the urgency in her movements. She approached him quickly, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Carter?" she asked. Ethan jumped to his feet, his heart racing. "Yes, that's me. How is she? Is she going to be okay?" "We're still assessing her condition," the nurse replied, her voice calm but firm. "But she's stable for now. We've called in our lead doctor for this case, Dr. Marcus Adams. He'll be overseeing her care." "Dr. Adams?" Ethan repeated, a frown forming on his face. He had heard the name before but couldn't quite place it. There was something in the way the nurse said it, as though she was trying to reassure him. But Ethan felt a twinge of unease. He hadn't met this doctor before, and in a situation like this, he wasn't sure if he wanted someone unfamiliar. "Dr. Adams is one of the best in the field," the nurse continued, noting the hesitation in Ethan's expression. "He specializes in critical care, and he's handled cases like this many times before." Ethan nodded slowly, but his stomach tightened. His mind wandered back to that fleeting sense of doubt. He didn't know why, but something didn't sit right with him. He had always been particular about who he trusted, and this felt different. Minutes later, the doors to the emergency room swung open, and a tall, commanding figure stepped out into the waiting area. Dr. Marcus Adams was a man of quiet strength, his presence unmistakable even in the crowded hospital. His dark skin and sharp, intelligent eyes gave him an air of authority, and the way he carried himself, calm, composed, told everyone around him that he was in control. He walked with purpose toward Ethan, his surgical scrubs crisp, the ID badge hanging from his neck catching the light as he moved. There was no hint of hesitation in his stride, no uncertainty in the way he approached the situation. "Mr. Carter?" Dr. Adams asked, his voice smooth but firm as he extended his hand. Ethan stood slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the doctor's appearance. "Yes, that's me. I'm Dr. Adams. I'll be overseeing your wife's care. I've reviewed her case, and I want to assure you that we're doing everything we can to stabilize her condition." Ethan nodded, but his mind was spinning. He had never had an issue with race before, at least he didn't think he had. But something about the situation was making him uncomfortable. His eyes flicked to the doctor's hand, still extended in greeting, and after a moment's hesitation, he shook it. "Thank you, doctor," Ethan said, though his voice was tight. Dr. Adams nodded, his expression unreadable. He had seen this reaction before, too many times to count. The brief hesitation, the way patients or family members seemed to doubt him, not because of his skills, but because of his skin color. It was a subtle thing, often unspoken, but it was there, always there. But Dr. Adams didn't let it faze him. He never did. His job was to save lives, and that's exactly what he intended to do. "Your wife's condition is critical," Dr. Adams continued, his tone professional and composed. "She has internal bleeding, and we need to act quickly to prevent further complications. I recommend immediate surgery." "Surgery?" Ethan's voice wavered. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. "I understand this is difficult to hear," Dr. Adams said gently, "but time is of the essence. If we don't operate soon, we risk losing both your wife and your child." Ethan's heart dropped at those words. Losing both Sophia and the baby? The thought was unbearable, but then the doubt crept in again, unbidden. Dr. Adams was calm, composed, but something in Ethan's gut twisted. He didn't know this man. Could he really trust him with Sophia's life? Ethan's hands were trembling, his mind racing as Dr. Adams's words echoed in his head. Immediate surgery. The very idea sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't ready to lose control of the situation, and he wasn't ready to place his trust in a man he didn't know, especially someone who had sparked an unease within him that he couldn't quite explain. "Wait," Ethan blurted, stepping forward as Dr. Adams turned to go. "Are you sure? I mean, is there another doctor? I'd like a second opinion." Dr. Adams paused, his face carefully composed, though Ethan noticed a flicker of something, disappointment, frustration, in his eyes. "I understand this is overwhelming, Mr. Carter, but your wife's condition is deteriorating, and we don't have time to wait for another doctor to assess her. Every minute counts." Ethan felt a surge of panic. He knew the doctor was right. He could see it in the way the nurses moved, the quiet urgency in their actions. But his instincts, the part of him that had always relied on control, screamed that this was wrong. He didn't want to trust Dr. Adams. Not yet. "There must be someone else," Ethan insisted, his voice rising slightly. "Someone I know, Dr. Thomas Bradley. He treated my wife last year. He's the one I want." Dr. Adams' expression didn't change, but there was a moment of silence before he responded. "Dr. Bradley is not on call tonight, Mr. Carter. I can assure you that I'm more than qualified to handle this. I've performed hundreds of surgeries like this, and I understand the gravity of the situation." But Ethan shook his head. "Number I want Dr. Bradley. Get him here." A strained silence filled the room. The nurse standing beside Dr. Adams glanced nervously between the two men, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the air. Every second felt like it was dragging on for an eternity. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his palms sweating as he waited for Dr. Adams' response. The doctor finally sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He understood the fear in Ethan's eyes. He had seen it in countless families before, that desperate need to feel in control when everything was spiraling out of their hands. But he also knew what was at stake, and the delay was costing precious time. "I'll have someone call Dr. Bradley," Dr. Adams said, his tone clipped but professional. "But I need you to understand, Mr. Carter, that every minute we wait, your wife's condition worsens. If Dr. Bradley doesn't arrive soon, I'll have no choice but to proceed without him." Ethan swallowed hard, guilt twisting in his stomach. He knew he was making things more complicated, but he couldn't help it. The fear had taken root, and distrust was gnawing at him. He could feel it tightening around his throat like a noose. Dr. Adams turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing in the middle of the waiting room, his mind spinning with confusion and doubt. The nurse approached him cautiously, her voice soft as she asked, "Mr. Carter, would you like me to get you some water? Maybe you should sit down." But Ethan waved her off. He couldn't sit. He couldn't do anything but wait. And waiting was the hardest part of all. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Ethan paced the waiting room, his mind spiraling with what-ifs. What if Dr. Bradley didn't make it in time? What if Sophia's condition worsened while they waited? What if he had made the wrong decision? Each time his thoughts turned toward Dr. Adams, Ethan felt a pang of shame. He knew deep down that the doctor was capable, that the nurse had vouched for him, that the hospital trusted him with the most critical cases. But his own fear had blinded him, and now all he could do was second-guess every instinct. More families filed into the emergency room, each one a reminder of the chaos unfolding in the lives of others. But Ethan felt detached from the world around him, his focus narrowing to the hallway beyond the double doors where Sophia had disappeared. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors swung open, and a man in his mid-50s entered, his salt and pepper hair disheveled, his face drawn with exhaustion. It was Dr. Thomas Bradley. Ethan rushed toward him, relief flooding his chest. "Dr. Bradley, thank God you're here," he said, his voice breathless with desperation. "It's Sophia. She collapsed, and they said she needs surgery. I couldn't." Dr. Bradley held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let's not waste time with explanations right now," he said, his tone brisk. "Where is she?" The nurse who had been attending to Ethan stepped forward. "She's been prepped for surgery, but Dr. Adams has been waiting for your arrival. The patient is in critical condition." Dr. Bradley nodded, his face hardening with focus. "All right, let's go." Ethan followed closely as they made their way down the hall toward the operating room, his heart pounding with renewed intensity. He was still scared, terrified even, But with Dr. Bradley in charge, he felt a sliver of control returning. As they reached the operating room, the door swung open, and there stood Dr. Adams, fully scrubbed and ready to begin. His eyes met Ethan's briefly, and though his face remained composed, there was something in his gaze, something like disappointment. Dr. Bradley stepped forward, his expression curt. "I'll be taking over, Doctor." Dr. Adams nodded once, though his eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, noting the time that had already slipped away. "She's unstable," he said calmly. "I suggest we move quickly. There's a risk of severe internal bleeding." "I've got it from here," Dr. Bradley replied sharply, moving to the head of the operating table. Without another word, Dr. Adams stepped back, allowing Dr. Bradley to take control. The tension in the room was palpable, but there was no time to dwell on it. Sophia's life hung in the balance, and every second counted. The atmosphere in the operating room was thick with urgency. Nurses moved swiftly, handing instruments to Dr. Bradley as he worked, his hands steady but slower than they should have been. Fatigue clung to him like a heavy cloak, his eyes bloodshot from being roused in the middle of the night. He had performed countless surgeries before, but tonight, something fell off. Dr. Adams stood to the side, watching silently. He had learned long ago how to suppress his emotions during critical moments like these, how to keep his frustration in check. But tonight was different. Tonight, the delay had been caused by something far more insidious than just medical uncertainty. He knew it, and so did everyone else in the room. Ethan watched from the observation window, his breath shallow as he stared at the scene unfolding before him. He could barely see Sophia through the haze of doctors and nurses, but the sight of her pale body lying motionless on the table made his stomach churn. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had wanted control, wanted to feel safe, but now, watching the slow, methodical pace of Dr. Bradley's work, he wasn't sure he had made the right decision after all. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. The only sounds were the soft hum of the machines and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. But even that began to change. The beeping grew faster, more erratic, and a nurse glanced nervously at the monitors. "Her blood pressure is dropping," she said, her voice tense. "We're losing her." Dr. Bradley cursed under his breath, his hands moving faster now. But the damage had already been done. The bleeding was worse than he had anticipated, and he wasn't making progress fast enough to save her. "We need to stabilize her now," Dr. Bradley muttered, his voice rising with frustration. "Give me more suction. I can't see." Another nurse stepped forward, her face pale with fear. "Dr. Bradley, her vitals are crashing." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind reeling as he watched the monitors. The beeping had become a near-constant alarm, each shrill sound a reminder of how close they were to losing Sophia. This couldn't be happening, not now, not like this. Dr. Bradley's movements became more frantic, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to stop the bleeding. But it was no use. The blood loss was too severe, and his exhaustion was making it impossible to keep up. Finally, after what felt like hours, Dr. Bradley stepped back from the table, ripping off his gloves in frustration. His face was flushed, his chest heaving with the effort of trying and failing to save the woman on the table. "I can't do it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need Dr. Adams, now." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut through. Dr. Adams, who had been standing quietly to the side, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He had known this moment was coming, the moment when the reality of the situation would catch up to them all. Without a word, Dr. Adams moved to the head of the table, his hands steady as he took control. The nurses, sensing the shift in authority, immediately fell in line, moving quickly to support him as he worked. Ethan watched from the window, his mind numb with fear and guilt. This was his fault. He had let his own bias cloud his judgment, and now his wife's life was hanging by a thread. Dr. Adams hadn't said a word to him, but Ethan could feel the weight of his disappointment, the unspoken truth that this delay had cost them precious time. Dr. Adams worked with a calm precision that seemed to bring the entire room back into focus. His hands moved quickly, his eyes sharp as he assessed the situation. The bleeding was severe, but it wasn't beyond repair, not yet. He directed the team with quiet authority, his voice steady as he gave instructions. "Suction here. I need to clamp this artery. Increase her fluids. Now." The nurses responded immediately, their hands moving as one with the doctor's commands. The beeping of the heart monitor slowed slightly, the erratic rhythm beginning to stabilize as Dr. Adams worked to stop the bleeding. Ethan watched in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time since the night began, he felt a glimmer of hope. Dr. Adams was in control, and for the first time, Ethan realized just how much he had underestimated the man standing in front of him. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the hushed movements of the nurses. Dr. Marcus Adams worked with meticulous focus, his gloved hands steady and confident as they moved over Sophia's fragile body. The tension that had gripped the room since Dr. Bradley had stepped back seemed to dissipate under the weight of Dr. Adams' calm authority. Ethan could only watch from the observation window, his hands pressed against the cool glass, his knuckles white. He could barely breathe, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared down at his wife. She looked so fragile, so small, lying there under the harsh lights of the operating room. The fear that gripped him was almost paralyzing. He had come so close to losing her, and yet even now, as Dr. Adams fought to save her, Ethan's guilt was overwhelming. He had made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. He had let his fear, his prejudice, cloud his judgment, and it had almost cost Sophia her life. How could he have been so blind? Inside the operating room, Dr. Adams moved quickly, his focus unbroken as he repaired the damage caused by internal bleeding. His team responded to his commands with precision, handing him the tools he needed as he worked to save Sophia. "Clamp here, doctor," Adams said, his voice steady. "Increase fluids. We need to stabilize her pressure." The nurse moved swiftly, following his instructions with practiced ease. The steady hum of the machines created a backdrop to the life-and-death battle being waged on the operating table. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, every movement and decision deliberate, measured. Ethan watched in a daze, his guilt gnawing at him. How had he allowed this to happen? He had been so focused on finding control, on ensuring that everything was done according to his plan, that he had failed to see the reality of the situation. Dr. Adams had been there all along, ready to save Sophia, but Ethan had pushed him aside, letting his own biases dictate his decisions. He felt sick to his stomach. Dr. Adams' hands moved quickly, his eyes scanning Sophia's vitals as the machines continued to beep steadily. Slowly, methodically, he began to bring her back from the brink. The bleeding was under control, and the color started to return to her cheeks. It was a delicate process, one that required skill and precision, but Dr. Adams was calm, unwavering in his focus. "Vitals are stabilizing," the anesthesiologist said quietly, his eyes fixed on the monitor. "Blood pressure is holding." A ripple of relief passed through the room, though no one dared to express it aloud. They weren't out of the woods yet. Dr. Adams worked for what felt like an eternity, his hands moving with precision and care. The tension in the room began to ease, though no one dared to relax completely. Sophia was stable for now, but there was still more work to be done. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Dr. Adams stepped back from the table, his face slick with sweat but his expression calm. "She's stable," he said quietly, addressing the team. "Let's get her to post-op." The nurses moved quickly, preparing Sophia to be transferred to recovery. The worst of the crisis had passed, but the air was still thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His legs felt weak, and he had to grip the edge of the window for support. Relief washed over him, but it was mixed with an overwhelming sense of shame. He had almost lost everything, and it was his fault. Ethan paced the waiting room, his mind racing. The sterile white walls of the hospital seemed to close in around him, amplifying the weight of his guilt. Every step felt heavier, the realization of what he had done pressing down on him with crushing force. He had let his fear dictate his actions, had let his prejudice stand in the way of his wife's survival. And now, even though she was stable, the consequences of his actions weighed heavily on his heart. What if Dr. Adams hadn't been there? What if they had lost her? The doors to the operating room swung open, and Dr. Adams stepped out, his surgical mask still hanging around his neck, his expression composed but weary. He looked up, locking eyes with Ethan. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with the weight of what had just transpired. Ethan could barely meet the doctor's gaze, the shame too raw. Too overwhelming. Dr. Adams approached slowly, his hands resting at his sides. "Your wife is stable," he said, his voice calm, professional. "We've managed to stop the bleeding, and she's in recovery now. She's still weak, but the worst is over." Ethan swallowed hard, the relief mingling with the guilt that gnawed at his insides. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for saving her." Dr. Adams nodded, but his eyes held a quiet intensity, a weight that Ethan couldn't ignore. "I did what any doctor would do," he said simply, his tone neutral. "I was just doing my job." The words hung in the air, unspoken truths lingering between them. Ethan wanted to say more, wanted to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. He had been wrong, so terribly wrong, and now he didn't know how to make it right. "I made a mistake," Ethan finally managed, his voice trembling. "I didn't trust you. I let my own fears, my own prejudices, get in the way. I'm sorry." Dr. Adams regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had heard apologies like this before, from people who had judged him without knowing him, from those who had let their own biases cloud their judgment. It was always the same as a realization, a moment of regret. But this time, standing before the man who had almost lost his wife, the apology felt different. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Carter," Dr. Adams said quietly, his voice measured. "But understand this, it's not just about trusting me as a doctor. It's about trusting the system, about trusting people to do their jobs regardless of who they are or what they look like. Prejudice doesn't just hurt individuals, it hurts everyone. It creates barriers where there should be none." Ethan nodded slowly, his throat tightening as the weight of Dr. Adams' words settled over him. He had let his own fear build those barriers, had let his own ignorance create a divide that almost cost him everything. "I don't know how to make up for what I did," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Adams studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It starts by acknowledging the problem. And then, you have to be willing to change, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you." Ethan felt the sting of those words deep in his chest. He had spent so much of his life in control, building walls to protect himself from anything that might challenge his worldview. But now, standing here in the sterile halls of the hospital, he realizes how those walls had nearly destroyed him. "Thank you," Ethan whispered again, his voice cracking. I'll do better." "I promise." Dr. Adams nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the waiting room, the silence heavy around him. Hours later, Ethan was allowed into Sophia's recovery room. The hospital bed dominated the small, sterile space, and Sophia lay still beneath the thin white sheets, her face pale but peaceful. Her chest rose and fell steadily, a sign that her body was slowly healing. Ethan approached the bed slowly, his heart aching as he looked down at her. The beeping of the machines filled the room, a steady reminder of the fragility of life. He reached for her hand, gently holding it in his own, careful not to disturb her. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Tears blurred his vision as he thought about what could have happened, how close he had come to losing her. He couldn't bear the thought of it, couldn't imagine a life without her by his side. Sophia stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering as she slowly came back to consciousness. Her eyes opened, and for a moment they were unfocused, dazed by the medication and the trauma her body had endured. But then her gaze found Ethan, and a soft, weak smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Hey," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, and he squeezed her hand gently. "Hey," he replied, his voice thick with relief. "You're going to be okay." Sophia nodded slightly, her eyes fluttering closed again as exhaustion overtook her. But she was alive. She was safe. And for that, Ethan was more grateful than he could ever put into words. As he sat beside her bed watching her sleep, Ethan made a silent vow to himself. He would change. He would be better. Not just for Sophia, but for their unborn child. For the future they were building together. And it would start now. Ethan sat beside Sophia's hospital bed, watching her sleep as the rhythmic beeping of the machines filled the room with their steady pulse. Hours had passed since the surgery, and though Sophia's condition had stabilized, the weight of what had happened still hung heavily in the air. He hadn't left her side since the nurses had allowed him in, his guilt keeping him rooted in the small, sterile room. He replayed the events of the night over and over in his mind, unable to shake the image of Dr. Adams stepping in to save her after he had insisted on waiting for Dr. Bradley. Ethan's throat tightened as he thought about it. How could he have been so blind? How had he allowed his own prejudice, his fear, to dictate his decisions in a moment so critical? The guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. Sophia stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering as she slowly woke from her drug-induced sleep. Her eyes were still heavy, her body weak from the ordeal she had just survived. But when her gaze found Ethan, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Hey," she whispered, her voice soft and raspy. Ethan leaned forward, taking her hand gently in his. "Hey," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "How are you feeling?" Sophia blinked slowly, her eyes fluttering shut again for a moment as she gathered the strength to respond. "Tired," she murmured. "But okay, I think." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them back, squeezing her hand gently. "You're more than okay," he said, his voice trembling. "You're a miracle." Sophia's lips curved into a faint smile, though it was clear she was still too weak to say much more. Her eyes fluttered closed once again, and soon she was asleep, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that brought Ethan a sense of fragile peace. But even as relief washed over him, Ethan's mind remained restless. He couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Adams, about the way he had saved Sophia's life when everything seemed to be slipping away. And more than that, Ethan couldn't ignore the bitter truth that had been haunting him ever since the surgery ended. He had almost cost Sophia her life because of his own ignorance. The next morning, Ethan sat in the small hospital cafeteria, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands as he stared down at the table. Lost in thought. The world outside the hospital walls felt distant and irrelevant. His entire universe had shrunk to the sterile, cold halls of St. Andrews, to the small recovery room where Sophia slept, to the weight of his guilt that refused to lift. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the events of the previous night played over in his mind. The moment when Dr. Bradley admitted defeat, the way Dr. Adams had stepped in and taken control, his hands steady, his voice calm, even as time slipped away. And the look on Dr. Adams' face when Ethan had finally apologized, it was a look Ethan couldn't shake. He knew he had to do more than just apologize. He had to make things right. Somehow. As he sat there contemplating his next steps, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw Dr. Adams walking into the cafeteria, his expression composed but tired. The night had clearly taken a toll on him too. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he considered staying silent, letting the doctor pass by without saying anything. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. He had to face this, had to face the man who had saved his wife. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stood up, approaching Dr. Adams before he could leave. "Dr. Adams," he called out, his voice quieter than he had intended. Dr. Adams paused, turning to face him. His expression was neutral, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice calm. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "I wanted to thank you again. For everything. To save Sophia. I know I said it before, but it doesn't feel like enough." Dr. Adams nodded slightly, his eyes studying Ethan with quiet intensity. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I was doing my job." "I know," Ethan replied quickly, his heart pounding. "But it's more than that. I need to apologize again. I need you to know that I was wrong. So wrong. I let my own fear and my own—" He hesitated, the word feeling heavy on his tongue. "Prejudice. Get in the way of your work. I didn't trust you, and I should have. I was blind to the fact that you were the one who could save her." Dr. Adams remained silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had heard apologies like this before, apologies born of guilt, of fear. But there was something different about the way Ethan spoke now. Something more genuine, more raw. "You were scared," Dr. Adams finally said, his voice soft but firm. "And fear can make people do things they wouldn't normally do. I've seen it before. But understand that prejudice doesn't just hurt the people it's directed at. It creates walls where there should be none. It blinds us to the humanity in one another." Ethan nodded, his throat tight as he absorbed the weight of Dr. Adams' words. I understand that now, he said quietly. I've lived my whole life thinking that I was a good person, that I wasn't someone who judged others. But last night, it showed me how wrong I was. I let my own bias nearly destroy everything. Dr. Adams's eyes softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. Change doesn't happen overnight, Mr. Carter. It starts with recognizing the problem. And from there, you have to be willing to confront it. Not just for yourself, but for your family, for the people around you. It's a long road. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he listened to the doctor's words. He knew that what Dr. Adams was saying was true. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. He had to change, had to work toward being better, not just for Sophia, but for their future child. I want to do better, Ethan said, his voice quiet but resolute. I will do better. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to figure it out. Dr. Adams studied him for a moment, then nodded. That's a good place to start. Over the next few days, as Sophia continued to recover, Ethan found himself grappling with the weight of Dr. Adams' words. Change didn't happen overnight. It was a process, a long and often uncomfortable journey. But for the first time in his life, Ethan was ready to confront the parts of himself he had been too afraid to face. He spent hours sitting at Sophia's bedside, watching her sleep, thinking about the future they were building together. Their child, still growing, still fragile, would be born into a world that was far from perfect. But Ethan knew that he had to be part of the solution, that he had to work toward making the world a better place for his family. As he sat there, his thoughts turned to Dr. Adams once again. The doctor had shown incredible grace and professionalism, even in the face of Ethan's prejudice. He had saved Sophia's life without hesitation, without holding a grudge. It was more than Ethan could have ever asked for. But it wasn't enough for Ethan to simply be grateful. He wanted to do more, to be part of the fight against the very prejudice that had nearly cost him everything. That night, after leaving the hospital for a brief respite, Ethan began researching organizations dedicated to fighting racial discrimination in healthcare. He read stories of doctors like Dr. Adams, who had faced prejudice and bias throughout their careers, and of patients who had suffered as a result of those biases. The more he read, the more determined he became. He couldn't change the past, but he could work toward a better future. He could use his platform, his resources, to help break down the barriers that still existed in healthcare and in society as a whole. A few days later, Ethan sat across from Sophia in her hospital room, the faint beeping of the heart monitor filling the space with its steady rhythm. Sophia was stronger now, her color returning and her energy slowly coming back. But there was still quiet heaviness between them, an unspoken understanding of how close they had come to losing everything. Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. Sophia, he said softly, taking her hand in his. There's something I need to tell you. Sophia looked up at him, her eyes soft but curious. What is it? Ethan hesitated for a moment, then continued. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how I acted. And I know I've already apologized to you and to Dr. Adams, but I need to do more. I need to be part of the solution. Sophia squeezed his hand gently, her eyes filled with understanding. You don't have to carry this alone, Ethan. We'll figure it out together. Ethan nodded, grateful for her support. I know, but I want to make things right. I've been reading about organizations that fight against racial bias in healthcare, and I think I want to get involved. I want to use what I've learned, what we've been through, to help other families avoid what we almost went through. Sophia smiled softly, her eyes shining with pride. That's a beautiful idea, and I think it's exactly what you need to do. Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him for the first time in days. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that change would take time and effort. But with Sophia by his side, and with the lessons he had learned from Dr. Adams, he felt ready to take the first step toward making things right. Ethan sat in his home office late into the night, his laptop opened in front of him, the soft glow of the screen casting shadows across the room. His mind raced as he scrolled through articles and research on racial bias in healthcare, each story painting a clearer picture of the systemic issues that had nearly cost him everything. His coffee cup sat cold and untouched beside him, forgotten in the midst of his reading. He was consumed by information, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his guilt anymore. This was about making a difference, about ensuring that what had happened to him and Sophia didn't happen to anyone else. The more Ethan read, the more he understood how pervasive the problem was. Studies showed that Black patients were often treated differently than their white counterparts, receiving less pain management, fewer diagnostic tests, and being less likely to receive life-saving interventions. And for doctors like Dr. Adams, prejudice in the medical field wasn't just an occasional inconvenience, it was a daily reality. Ethan's heart tightened as he read stories from patients and doctors alike, their experiences echoing his own. He couldn't believe how blind he had been for so long, how he had lived his life thinking that prejudice wasn't something that affected him. But now it was all so clear. He needed to do something. The next morning, after another sleepless night, Ethan made a decision. He reached out to the Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition, an organization dedicated to fighting racial disparities in medical treatment. The coalition had been involved in numerous initiatives to improve care for patients of color, and Ethan knew that this was where he needed to start. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he typed out a short email. Subject: Interested in partnering with REHC. Dear Racial Equity and Healthcare Coalition team, my name is Ethan Carter. I recently experienced firsthand the devastating effects of racial bias in the healthcare system, and it nearly cost my wife her life. I have since reflected deeply on my own prejudices and the larger systemic issues at play, and I want to do something about it. I have resources, a platform, and the determination to help fight against racial disparities in healthcare. I'd like to know more about how I can contribute and partner with your organization to make a lasting impact. Please let me know how I can get involved. Sincerely, Ethan Carter. Ethan hit send before he could second-guess himself. It wasn't much, just an email, but it was the first step towards something bigger. A part of him was nervous, unsure of what he could bring to the table. After all, he was just a businessman, someone who had spent his life focused on numbers and contracts, but now he wanted to be more than that. He needed to be more than that. As he leaned back in his chair, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. 2 days later, Ethan received a reply from the Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition. His heart raced as he opened the email. Subject: Thank you for your interest. Dear Ethan Carter, thank you for reaching out to the Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition. We appreciate your willingness to contribute to our cause and share your experience with us. We believe that personal stories like yours are vital to raising awareness about the biases that exist in our healthcare system. We would love to set up a meeting with you to discuss potential partnerships and ways you can get involved. Our team will be in touch soon to schedule a time that works for you. Thank you for your commitment to equity in healthcare. Best, Maya Johnson, Director, Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition. Ethan stared at the email for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. This was it. The beginning of something real. A way to turn his guilt and regret into action, to fight back against the prejudice that had nearly taken Sophia from him. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was Dr. Adams calling. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of what to say. Their last conversation had been intense, and while Ethan had apologized, he still felt the weight of everything that had happened between them. But he knew he couldn't avoid this. He owed Dr. Adams more than just gratitude. He needed to build a bridge between them, to prove that he was truly committed to change. Taking a deep breath, Ethan answered the call. Dr. Adams, he said, his voice steady but cautious. It's good to hear from you. Ethan, Dr. Adams replied, his tone calm but guarded. I wanted to check in on Sophia. I heard she's been moved to a different floor for her recovery. She has, Ethan confirmed. She's doing much better now thanks to you. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for what you did. Dr. Adams was silent for a moment, and Ethan could almost feel the doctor weighing his words. I'm glad to hear she's improving, Dr. Adams finally said. But I didn't call for gratitude. I called because I wanted to know what's next for you. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by question. What do you mean? I mean, you told me you wanted to change, Dr. Adams said, his voice even. You told me you wanted to be better. So I'm asking, what's your plan? What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else? Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Adams wasn't just asking for an apology, he was asking for action. And Ethan knew that this was the moment to show the doctor that he was serious. I've already started, Ethan said, his voice steady. I reached out to the Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition. I want to work with them to address the biases in healthcare, to help create change. I'm committed to this. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and Ethan's pulse quickened as he waited for Dr. Adams's response. Good, Dr. Adams finally said, his tone softening slightly. That's a start. Ethan exhaled, relief flooding through him. I meant what I said, Dr. Adams. I want to be part of the solution, and I'd like to talk more about how we can work together on this. I know you've faced challenges in your career because of the same biases that almost cost Sophia her life. I want to help you, and others like you, break down those barriers. Dr. Adams was silent for a moment, but when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. I've spent years dealing with prejudice in the medical field, Ethan, and it's not just about me. It's about the patients who don't get the care they deserve because of those biases. But if you're serious about helping, then I'm willing to work with you. Ethan felt a surge of hope. This was what he had been working toward. This partnership, this opportunity to truly make a difference. I'm serious, Ethan said, his voice firm. Let's do this. A week later, Ethan found himself sitting in a conference room at the Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition's headquarters. The walls were lined with posters advocating for healthcare reform and racial justice, and the air buzzed with a sense of urgency and purpose. Across from him sat Maya Johnson, the coalition's director, a woman with a commanding presence and a passion for equity that was immediately apparent. Beside her was Dr. Marcus Adams, who had agreed to join Ethan at the meeting. His calm demeanor was a steadying force in the room. Thank you both for coming, Maya said, her voice warm but direct. We're always looking for people who are willing to use their platforms and resources to fight for racial equity in healthcare. Ethan, your story is a powerful example of how racial bias can impact patient care. And Dr. Adams, your expertise and experience in the field are invaluable. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. I'm committed to doing whatever I can to help, he said. I want to use my platform to raise awareness and support initiatives that address these disparities. Maya leaned forward, her eyes focused on Ethan. That's a good start, but it's going to take more than just awareness. We need funding, we need advocates in positions of power, and we need to push for policy changes that will create lasting impact. Dr. Adams, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up. Ethan's story isn't unique, he said, his voice measured. Every day, patients of color face biases that affect the care they receive. It's not just about personal prejudice. It's about systemic issues that have been ingrained in the healthcare system for generations. Ethan felt a pang of guilt as he listened to Dr. Adams speak, but he also felt a growing sense of determination. This was why he was here, to be part of the solution, to help dismantle the very system that had nearly destroyed his family. I want to help with funding, Ethan said, his voice steady, and I want to use my company's platform to promote the coalition's work. I can reach out to my network, bring more people into this fight. Maya smiled, nodding approvingly. That's exactly what we need. We've already started working on several initiatives, including one that focuses on providing implicit bias training to medical staff. With your support, we can expand those programs and push for broader policy changes. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Ethan, Maya, and Dr. Adams discussing ways to bring more attention to the issue and create lasting change in the healthcare system. By the time the meeting ended, Ethan felt energized, hopeful. He had a plan now, a real way to make a difference. As they left the conference room, Dr. Adams walked beside him, his expression thoughtful. You've come a long way, Ethan, Dr. Adams said, his voice quiet but sincere. I wasn't sure what to expect when you first reached out, but I can see that you're serious about this. Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with pride. I am, and I'm grateful for the chance to work with you, Doctor. Adams, you've been through so much, and I want to make sure that the next generation of doctors and patients doesn't have to go through the same thing. Dr. Adams gave a small smile, though there was a weight behind it. There's still a long way to go, but if we can start here, maybe we can make things better. One step at a time. Ethan nodded, feeling the gravity of the task ahead. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to confront it head-on. The days following the meeting at the Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition were a whirlwind for Ethan. He threw himself into the work, reaching out to colleagues, old business contacts, and even clients, explaining the importance of the cause and rallying support. His company, previously known for its laser focus on tech development, was now being recognized for its involvement in healthcare reform. Maya Johnson had been instrumental in guiding him, helping Ethan understand the nuances of the healthcare system and the deeply rooted biases that existed within it. They had organized a fundraiser, with Ethan's company pledging to match every donation made toward the coalition's initiatives. It was a move that brought in substantial funds and garnered attention from other businesses looking to support the fight for equity. But while the money and publicity helped build momentum, Ethan knew that real change required more than just financial backing. He needed to show people, particularly those who had experienced the same fear and bias that he had, that this fight was personal. He had been on the wrong side of the issue, and now he wanted to be part of the solution. One evening, as he sat in his office finalizing details for an upcoming charity event, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Adams. Dr. Adams? Are you free tomorrow? I want to show you something. Ethan stared at the message for a moment, curious. Dr. Adams wasn't one for small talk, and his invitations were always purposeful. Ethan, I'm free. What's the plan? The reply came quickly. Dr. Adams, I want you to visit the clinic I work at on weekends. I think it will give you a clearer picture of what we're really fighting for. Ethan felt a surge of anticipation. This was exactly what he had been looking for, a way to see firsthand the impact of the work they were doing. Ethan, I'll be there. The next day, Ethan found himself driving through a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. The streets were busy, lined with old, worn-down buildings, the remnants of a neighborhood that had been largely overlooked by the city's rapid development. It was clear that this area had been forgotten by the booming economy that had transformed other parts of town. Dr. Adams' clinic was tucked between a laundromat and a small grocery store. The sign above the door was faded, the paint peeling, but the building buzzed with activity. As Ethan parked his car and stepped out, he felt a wave of humility. This was where Dr. Adams spent his weekends, helping the underserved and overlooked. Inside, the clinic was small but efficient. Patients sat in the waiting area, some holding young children, others flipping through outdated magazines as they waited to be seen. The walls were covered with posters about health education, emphasizing the importance of regular checkups, vaccinations, and disease prevention. Ethan spotted Dr. Adams near the reception desk, speaking quietly with one of the nurses. He looked up as Ethan entered, giving a brief nod. "Thanks for coming, Doctor," Adams said as he approached. "I wanted you to see this place. It's a community clinic. Most of our patients don't have insurance, and many of them avoid hospitals because they've had bad experiences with the healthcare system." Ethan glanced around, taking it all in. "You work here on weekends?" Dr. Adams nodded. "Every weekend. The need here is great. Most of these patients wouldn't get medical care at all if it weren't for this clinic. But we're underfunded, and we rely heavily on donations and volunteers." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He had lived a life of privilege, always having access to the best medical care. But here, in this small clinic, people were fighting just to get the most basic care they deserved. "I had no idea," Ethan admitted, his voice soft. I thought the coalition was fighting against systemic bias in hospitals, but this is the front line," Dr. Adams interrupted, his voice steady. "This is where the people who are most affected by the bias in healthcare come for help. They don't trust the system because the system has failed them." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the words. "How can I help here?" Dr. Adams smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're already helping by supporting the coalition. But there's more you can do. You have a platform, a voice that people listen to. Use it to talk about this. about the people who are being left behind. Ethan nodded again, his determination growing. I will. As they walked through the clinic, Dr. Adams introduced Ethan to some of the staff, nurses, volunteers, and even other doctors who worked tirelessly to provide care to those who needed it most. The clinic wasn't flashy or well-funded, but it was a lifeline for so many. And as Ethan watched the way Dr. Adams interacted with his patients, calm, compassionate, never in a rush, he realized just how much more there was to this man than he had ever known. After the visit to the clinic, Ethan couldn't shake the images of the people he had met, the stories they had shared about being turned away from hospitals or receiving subpar treatment simply because of the color of their skin or their lack of insurance haunted him. He had been blind for so long, wrapped up in his world of privilege, unaware of the struggles so many others faced. That evening, back at home, he sat down with Sophia, who was now much stronger and almost fully recovered from her ordeal. He had told her about the clinic, about Dr. Adams' work, and about the stark realities that he had seen firsthand. I can't believe how much I didn't know, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. There's this whole other world out there, people who are suffering, and I've been living my life completely unaware of it. Sophia reached out and took his hand, her eyes soft with understanding. You're not the same person you were, Ethan. You've grown so much since that night at the hospital. I'm trying, Ethan admitted, his voice breaking slightly. But it's not enough. I feel like there's so much more I need to do. Sophia squeezed his hand. You're doing it. You're working with the coalition. You're using your platform to raise awareness. And now you're seeing the real impact of healthcare inequality. That's more than most people ever do. Ethan nodded, but the guilt still lingered in his chest. I just wish I had seen it sooner. We can't change the past, Sophia said softly, but we can make sure we're part of changing the future. Her words settled over Ethan like a balm, soothing the ache in his heart. He knew she was right. The work he was doing now was important, and while he couldn't undo his past mistakes, he could use them to fuel his drive for change. As the coalition's initiatives gained traction, Ethan and Dr. Adams began pushing for more significant policy changes, both within the healthcare system and beyond. They wanted to implement mandatory bias training for all medical staff, increase funding for community clinics like the one Dr. Adams worked at, and advocate for legislation that would address racial disparities in healthcare access and treatment. But the road to change was far from smooth. One afternoon, Ethan received an email from a business associate who had heard about his involvement with the coalition. The message was brief but pointed. Subject, a word of caution. Ethan, I've been hearing about your involvement with this healthcare reform thing. Be careful. People don't like it when you start talking about racial issues, especially not in the corporate world. I'm just looking out for you, but you might want to think twice before you push too hard on this. Best, Alan. Ethan stared at the email, his anger simmering just below the surface. Was this what people thought? That advocating racial equity in healthcare somehow controversial? He couldn't believe that there were still people who would turn a blind eye to the injustice simply because it made them uncomfortable. He forwarded the email to Dr. Adams, who responded almost immediately. Dr. Adams, this is the resistance we're up against, but we can't stop now. Ethan's resolve only hardened. He knew there would be pushback, knew that some people, especially those in positions of power, wouldn't want to face the uncomfortable truths about racial bias in healthcare. But that wasn't going to stop him. The fundraiser Ethan had organized was coming up, and he knew it would be a pivotal moment for their cause. The money raised would go directly to funding bias training in hospitals and supporting clinics like the one Dr. Adams worked at. But more than that, the event would be an opportunity to bring awareness to the issue on a national scale. The night of the fundraiser arrived, and the event was packed. CEOs, doctors, community leaders, and activists filled the grand ballroom, all gathered to support the coalition's initiatives. Ethan had pulled out all the stops, ensuring that the event was high-profile enough to attract media attention and bring the issue of racial bias in healthcare to the forefront of public discourse. Dr. Adams stood beside him as they greeted guests, his calm demeanor a steadying presence. Ethan had never been more nervous in his life, not even during the biggest deals of his career. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about something far more important. As the evening progressed, Ethan delivered a speech, sharing his personal story of how his own bias had nearly cost his wife her life. He spoke about the work the coalition was doing, about the clinic he had visited with Dr. Adams, and about the need for systemic change in the healthcare system. His words resonated with the audience, and by the end of the night, they had raised more money than they had ever hoped for. But the real victory came later, when Dr. Adams approached Ethan, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You did good tonight," Dr. Adams said quietly. Ethan exhaled, the weight of the night finally lifted. "We did good." The success of the fundraiser gave Ethan a sense of validation he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, he saw the direct impact of his efforts to combat racial bias in healthcare. The amount of money raised exceeded expectations, and the media coverage helped bring the issue to a much wider audience. But with success came resistance. The more visibility the cause gained, the more pushback Ethan and Dr. Adams encountered. Some hospital boards and healthcare administrators balked at the idea of mandatory bias training, citing costs and questioning its necessity. There were also whispers in the corporate world, where some of Ethan's old colleagues saw his involvement in healthcare reform as a risky venture. One afternoon, Ethan sat in his office, his phone buzzing constantly with calls and messages. He had just finished a call with one of the coalition's major donors, who had expressed concerns about the political nature of the work they were doing. The donor's message had been clear: pull back or risk losing support. Frustration simmered inside Ethan as he turned to Dr. Adams, who was sitting across from him, reviewing plans for their next policy push. "We're getting pressure from all sides," Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. "I just got off the phone with one of our biggest donors. They're worried about how this is going to look politically." Dr. Adams didn't look up from the papers in front of him. "This isn't about politics. It's about people's lives. You know that. But to them, it's all about optics," Ethan replied, his voice edged with frustration. "I've already gotten a few messages from business partners warning me to be careful about how far I push this." Dr. Adams finally looked up, his expression calm but firm. "Are you going to listen to them?" Ethan stared at him for a moment, the question hanging in the air. He had sacrificed so much to get this far, to prove that he was committed to fighting against the very biases that had almost cost him everything. He had walked away from partnerships, lost deals, and taken financial risks that would have seemed unthinkable a year ago. But he had never been more certain of anything in his life. He wasn't going to back down now. "No," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm not. I don't care what they think. We're doing the right thing." Dr. Adams nodded, a small flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good. Because if we let them stop us now, we'll never see the changes we're fighting for." As the coalition's efforts gained more traction, Ethan found himself spending less and less time at home. He was constantly traveling, meeting with hospital boards, lawmakers, and other healthcare leaders to push for the implementation of bias training and increased funding for underserved clinics. The work was fulfilling, but it came at a cost. Sophia, who had fully recovered from her ordeal, was now left to manage most of their home life. She supported Ethan's mission wholeheartedly, but there were days when she missed the man she had married, the man who had once been so focused on building their life together. One evening, after Ethan had returned home late from yet another meeting, Sophia sat him down at the kitchen table. The kids were asleep, and the house was quiet, but the tension between them was palpable. "We need to talk," Sophia said softly, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Ethan, sensing the gravity of her tone, sat down across from her. "What's going on?" Sophia sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "I know how important this work is to you, and I'm proud of everything you're doing, but we're starting to feel the distance." Ethan's chest tightened. He had known this conversation was coming. He had felt the strain on their relationship growing over the past few months, but he had convinced himself that it was temporary, that once things calmed down, they'd find their way back to each other. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I know I've been away a lot. I just feel like if we don't push this now, we'll lose momentum. We're so close to making real changes." Sophia nodded, her expression softening. I understand that. I do. But the changes you're fighting for aren't going to happen overnight. This is a long-term fight, and I need to know that you're not going to lose yourself in it. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle over him. She was right. The work he was doing was important, but so was his family. He had promised himself that he would fight for change, but he had also promised Sophia that he would be there for her, for their family. I don't want to lose myself in this, Ethan said quietly, and I don't want to lose us. I'm trying to find the balance. Sophia reached out and took his hand, her eyes filled with understanding. We'll figure it out together, but you need to make time for us too. We can't keep living like this, constantly waiting for you to come home. Ethan nodded, squeezing her hand. You're right. I'll do better. I'll make more time for us. I promise. The conversation left Ethan feeling raw and vulnerable. He had always prided himself on his ability to juggle work and family, but now he realized that he had let one overshadow the other. And while the work he was doing with Dr. Adams was important, it couldn't come at the expense of his family. A few weeks later, Ethan and Dr. Adams were invited to speak at a national healthcare conference where they would present their findings on racial bias in the medical field and discuss the coalition's initiatives. It was a high-profile event, and Ethan knew that this was their chance to make a lasting impact on the national stage. The conference was held in Washington, D.C., and the ballroom was filled with healthcare leaders, policymakers, and media representatives. As Ethan and Dr. Adams prepared to take the stage, the air buzzed with anticipation. This was the moment they had been working toward for months, the chance to bring their message to the forefront of public discourse. As they took the stage, Ethan felt a surge of nerves, but he pushed it aside. He had practiced this speech countless times, and he knew the data inside and out. But this wasn't just about numbers or statistics. This was about people, about the lives that were being affected by the biases in the healthcare system. Dr. Adams began the presentation, speaking calmly and confidently about the racial disparities they had uncovered in their research. He outlined the coalition's initiatives, focusing on the need for systemic change in the way healthcare providers were trained and how patients of color were treated. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. Last year, my wife nearly died because of my own biases, Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment, and it almost cost me everything. But that experience opened my eyes to the realities of racial bias in healthcare, and it made me realize that this isn't just a problem for the medical field. It's a problem for all of us. The room was silent as Ethan continued, sharing his personal journey of growth and redemption, and explaining how the coalition's work was vital to creating a more equitable healthcare system. He spoke from the heart, knowing that this was his chance to make people understand the urgency of the issue. By the time he finished, the room erupted in applause. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was still ahead of them. In the days following the conference, the coalition's initiatives gained even more momentum. Hospital boards that had been reluctant to implement bias training began to reconsider, and lawmakers started drafting legislation that would address some of the systemic issues in healthcare. But with progress came new challenges. As Ethan and Dr. Adams pushed for more aggressive reforms, they encountered resistance from powerful lobbying groups within the healthcare industry. These groups, worried about the financial implications of the proposed changes, began a coordinated effort to discredit the coalition's work. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from Maya Johnson, the director of the coalition. "We have a problem," Maya said, her voice tense. "One of our major donors just pulled out. They're citing conflicts of interest as the reason." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? Which donor?" Maya hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's one of the biggest hospital systems in the country. They were funding a large portion of our bias training programs, but now they're backing out. And it's not just them. Other donors are starting to follow suit." Ethan felt a surge of anger. "Why? What happened?" "There's been a smear campaign," Maya explained. "Some of the lobbying groups are pushing a narrative that our work is politically motivated and that we're trying to impose unnecessary regulations on hospitals. They're spinning it to make us look like the bad guys." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was exactly what they had feared. The pushback from the industry was becoming more organized, more aggressive, and now it was threatening to derail everything they had worked for. Dr. Adams, who had been listening quietly on the other end of the call, finally spoke up. "We can't let them win," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We've come too far to back down now." Ethan nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. "What's our next move?" "We fight back," Maya said. "We rally our supporters, we push for more media coverage, and we keep pressing forward. This is a setback, but it's not the end." But as the call ended, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over him. He knew that the road ahead was going to be even more difficult than they had anticipated, and he wasn't sure if they had the resources to withstand the coming storm. The days following Maya's call were some of the hardest Ethan had faced since he first got involved with the Racial Equity and Healthcare Coalition. As news of the smear campaign spread, donors and supporters began to pull away, leaving the coalition scrambling to keep the momentum going. What had once felt like an unstoppable wave of progress now seemed fragile, threatened by powerful forces who saw the work they were doing as a threat. Ethan found himself on the phone constantly, fielding calls from concerned allies, trying to reassure them that they were still on track, that the smear campaign was baseless. But the more he spoke with people, the more he could feel the doubt creeping in. People were afraid of the backlash, afraid of losing their own standing in a world where challenging the status quo could come at a steep price. Dr. Adams, as always, remained calm and composed, though Ethan could see the strain starting to show. The doctor had dedicated his life to fighting for equity in healthcare, and now it seemed like all of their hard work was in jeopardy. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of damage control, Ethan sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen. His inbox was flooded with emails, some from supporters who were sticking with the coalition, but many from donors and business partners who were distancing themselves from the cause. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him, and when he glanced at the screen, he saw it was Dr. Adams calling. Ethan answered, trying to shake the exhaustion from his voice. "Hey, Dr. Adams." There was a brief pause before Dr. Adams spoke, his tone measured but heavy. "Ethan, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we step back, at least temporarily." Ethan sat up straighter, surprise and disbelief washing over him. "What? Step back? We can't step back now. We're so close." "I know," Dr. Adams said, his voice steady. "But this smear campaign is damaging our credibility, and if we keep pushing forward without addressing it head-on, we could lose everything. The media is starting to pick up on the negative stories, and if we don't find a way to counter this, it could derail all of our progress." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. "So what do? We can't just stop. People are counting on us." "I'm not saying we stop," Dr. Adams replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm saying we need to regroup. We need to figure out how to fight this the right way, with the resources we have left." Ethan clenched his fists, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had been so sure that they could overcome the challenges, that they could push through resistance. But now, faced with the reality of losing key supporters and watching their credibility crumble, he wasn't sure what to do. "I don't want to give up," Ethan said quietly, his voice strained. Dr. Adams sighed. "Neither do I. But sometimes taking a step back is the only way to move forward. We need to be smart about this." Ethan nodded, though he knew Dr. Adams couldn't see him. He said after a long pause, "We'll regroup, but we're not giving up," Dr. Adams agreed. "We're just finding another way." The decision to step back, even temporarily, felt like a defeat to Ethan, but he knew that Dr. Adams was right. They couldn't keep pushing forward blindly, not with the smear campaign threatening to destroy everything they had worked for. They needed to be strategic, to rebuild their credibility before they could continue their fight. Maya Johnson and the rest of the coalition leadership were in agreement. They would take a few weeks to reassess their position, gather more data, and prepare a comprehensive plan to counter the false narratives being spread about their work. It was frustrating, but necessary. During this time, Ethan tried to balance his commitment to the coalition with his responsibilities at home. He spent more time with Sophia and their children, recognizing that his family had been sidelined for too long in his quest to make things right. Sophia, ever supportive, encouraged him to use this time to reflect on how he could continue the fight while maintaining balance in his life. But the pressure weighed heavily on Ethan. He felt the guilt of not doing enough, the fear of losing ground in the battle against systemic injustice. Every day that passed felt like a missed opportunity, another chance for their opponents to gain the upper hand. One evening, as he sat on the couch with Sophia, she turned to him, her face soft but serious. "You've done so much already, Ethan," she said gently. "You don't have to carry this all by yourself." Ethan shook his head, his chest tight with frustration. "It feels like I'm failing, Sophia. We were making progress, and now it's slipping away." Sophia reached out and took his hand. "You're not failing. You're adapting. You're fighting a battle that's been going on for generations. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight." Ethan sighed, leaning his head back against the couch. "I just don't want to lose everything we've worked for." "You won't," Sophia said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "You're too stubborn for that." Ethan chuckled softly, grateful for her unwavering support. "You're right about that." After a few weeks of stepping back and regrouping, Ethan, Dr. Adams, and Maya reconvened to discuss their next steps. They had spent the time gathering new data, preparing a public relations strategy to counter the negative press, and rebuilding their network of supporters. "We need to shift the narrative," Maya said during their meeting. "The smear campaign is working because it's creating doubt, making people think that what we're doing is unnecessary or politically motivated. We need to show them the truth. We need to highlight the real stories, the patients who've been affected by bias, the doctors who've experienced discrimination firsthand." Ethan nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "We have the data. We have stories. We just need to make sure people hear them." Dr. Adams leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "We also need to engage the hospitals directly. Instead of pushing for mandates right away, we can offer voluntary bias training programs to the hospitals that are willing to participate. If we can get a few major hospitals on board, it will create a ripple effect." Maya agreed. "That's a smart move. Once we show that these programs are effective, it will be harder for the opposition to discredit us." They spent the next few hours refining their strategy, planning a series of public events and media appearances where they could present their findings and humanize the issue. They would focus on patient stories, on the real-world consequences of bias in healthcare, and they would work to rebuild their network of supporters from the ground up. By the end of the meeting, Ethan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in weeks. They weren't giving up. They were finding another way, just as Dr. Adams had said. The coalition's new strategy hinged on one key element: the stories of those who had been affected by bias in healthcare. They reached out to patients and doctors who had experienced discrimination and invited them to share their stories publicly. These stories were raw, emotional, and undeniably powerful. One of the most compelling stories came from a woman named Karen Taylor, whose son had died from complications that could have been prevented had the hospital taken her concerns seriously. Karen's story was heartbreaking. Her son had been admitted to the hospital with severe symptoms, but the doctors dismissed her concerns, assuming she was exaggerating. By the time they realized the severity of his condition, it was too late. Karen agreed to speak at one of the coalition's media events, and her testimony was nothing short of devastating. She stood in front of a room full of reporters, her voice trembling with emotion as she recounted the moment she realized her son was dying, the moment she knew the system had failed them. "He was only 12 years old," Karen said, tears streaming down her face. "He deserved better. And I'm standing here today because I don't want any other mother to go through what I went through." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and the cameras zoomed in on Karen's tear-streaked face. Ethan watched from the sidelines, his heart aching for Karen, but also filled with hope. This was the truth, the reality that so many people were blind to. And if they could get enough people to listen, they could start to shift the narrative. The media blitz continued over the next few weeks, with more patients and doctors coming forward to share their stories. The public response was overwhelming. Donations began to trickle back in, and some of the hospitals that had previously been hesitant to implement bias training reached out to the coalition, expressing interest in the voluntary programs Dr. Adams had proposed. It was working. Slowly but surely, they were rebuilding. After months of hard work, Ethan and Dr. Adams stood on the cusp of victory. The smear campaign had lost steam, and public opinion was beginning to turn in their favor. They had secured enough support to launch pilot programs in several major hospitals, and lawmakers were starting to pay attention. The coalition's efforts had become a national conversation, with media outlets covering the issue of racial bias in healthcare more than ever before. The momentum was back, and it felt stronger than ever. But the victory was bittersweet. Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The systemic issues they were addressing wouldn't be solved overnight, and there were still powerful forces working against them. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like they were truly making progress. As he stood in front of a packed auditorium at a national healthcare summit, preparing to deliver the keynote speech alongside Dr. Adams, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. A year ago, he had been blind to the realities of racial bias in healthcare. A year ago, his own prejudice had nearly cost him everything. But now he was part of something bigger, something that had the power to change lives. Dr. Adams stepped up to the podium first, delivering a powerful speech about the need for equity in healthcare, about the importance of seeing each patient as a human being, not as a set of assumptions or biases. The audience hung on his every word, captivated by his calm authority. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He looked out at the audience, doctors, policymakers, healthcare leaders, and began. "I'm here today because I made a mistake," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I let my own fears and biases cloud my judgment, and it almost cost my wife her life. But that mistake opened my eyes. It made me realize that this isn't just about me. This is about all of us. This is about creating a healthcare system where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The room was silent as Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. He spoke about the work the coalition had done, about the stories they had shared, and about the need for systemic change. By the time he finished, the audience was on their feet, applauding. It wasn't just applause for him. It was applause for the movement they had built, for the lives they had touched, for the change they were fighting for. As Ethan and Dr. Adams left the stage, walking side by side, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They weren't done yet. There was still so much work to do, but they had come so far, and they weren't going to stop. The weeks following the National Healthcare Summit were filled with a flurry of activity. Media coverage had given the coalition the boost it needed, and hospitals across the country were now reaching out to implement the voluntary bias training programs that Dr. Adams had championed. The pilot programs were already showing promise, with early data suggesting that patient outcomes were improving in the hospitals that had adopted the training. For Ethan, the success of the coalition's initiatives felt like a long-awaited validation of everything he had fought for. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where his focus shifted from immediate victories to building sustainable, long-term change. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in his office, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was Maya Johnson. "Maya," he said, answering with a smile, "I was just about to call you. I've been going over the latest reports from the hospitals, and the results are looking even better than we'd hoped." Maya's voice was warm on the other end of the line. "I know. It's incredible. The feedback from the hospital administrators has been overwhelmingly positive. It looks like we're finally turning a corner." Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling a wave of satisfaction washed over him. "It's hard to believe how far we've come in such a short time." "We wouldn't be here without you, Ethan," Maya said, her voice sincere. "You took your experience and turned it into something powerful. I know this hasn't been easy, but you've made a real difference." Ethan smiled, though there was a part of him that still struggled to fully accept the praise. "It's been a team effort. You, Dr. Adams, everyone at the coalition. We've all worked together to make this happen." Maya paused for a moment, then spoke again, her voice softening. "Speaking of Dr. Adams, I wanted to let you know that he's been nominated for the National Healthcare Equity Award. It's one of the highest honors in our field, and I can't think of anyone more deserving." Ethan's chest swelled with pride. "That's amazing news. He deserves it more than anyone." "I thought you'd want to be there when they make the announcement," Maya said. "It's happening next month, and I think it would mean a lot to him if you were there." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." That evening, after the call with Maya, Ethan found himself sitting on the porch with Sophia, a warm breeze rustling the trees in their backyard. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. Sophia sipped her tea and glanced at Ethan, her eyes filled with warmth. "You seem calmer lately," she observed with a smile. Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I feel like things are finally falling into place. The coalition's work is taking off. The hospital programs are making a real difference. It feels like we're finally making progress." Sophia smiled, but there was a hint of something deeper in her expression, something reflective. "You've come a long way, Ethan. Not just in the work you've done with the coalition, but in the way you've grown as a person." Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I wouldn't have made it through this without you," he said softly. "You've been my rock through everything." Sophia reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I've always believed in you, even when you doubted yourself. I knew you'd find your way." Ethan's throat tightened with emotion as he thought back to the night when everything had changed. The night when he had almost lost Sophia because of his own fears and prejudices. He had come so close to losing everything, but that moment had also been the catalyst for his transformation. It had forced him to confront the parts of himself he had been too afraid to face, and in doing so, he had discovered a deeper sense of purpose. "I never thought I'd end up here," Ethan said quietly, "fighting for something like this. But now I can't imagine doing anything else." Sophia smiled, her eyes twinkling with affection. "That's because you found your calling. You found a way to turn your pain into something meaningful." Ethan nodded, his heart full. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, always focused on the next deal, the next opportunity. But now, his definition of success has changed. It wasn't about money or power anymore. It was about making a difference, about leaving the world a little better than he had found it. A month later, Ethan found himself sitting in the audience at the National Healthcare Equity Awards, surrounded by some of the most influential figures in healthcare. The atmosphere in the room was electric, the air buzzing with anticipation as the ceremony began. Dr. Marcus Adams sat beside him, looking as composed as ever, though Ethan could see the faintest hint of nerves in his friend's usually calm demeanor. The nomination for the National Healthcare Equity Award had come as a surprise to Dr. Adams, but to Ethan and everyone else who knew him, it was long overdue. As the ceremony progressed, the host took the stage and began to announce the award for healthcare equity leadership. "This year's recipient has dedicated his life to fighting for equity in healthcare," the host began. "Through his tireless efforts, he has not only saved countless lives, but also pushed for systemic changes that will impact generations to come. His work with the Racial Equity and Healthcare Coalition has been instrumental in bringing awareness to the biases that exist within our medical system and finding solutions to address them." Ethan's heart swelled with pride as the host continued. "Please join me in congratulating this year's recipient of the National Healthcare Equity Award, Dr. Marcus Adams." The room erupted in applause as Dr. Adams stood, a look of quiet humility on his face. Ethan clapped loudly, his heart pounding with joy as he watched his friend and colleague make his way to the stage. Dr. Adams accepted the award, his movements deliberate and calm. When he reached the podium, he paused for a moment, surveying the crowd before he began to speak. "I am deeply honored to receive this award," Dr. Adams began, his voice steady. "But I want to make it clear that this award is not just for me. It's for everyone who has fought for healthcare equity, for everyone who has experienced the pain of bias in our system, and for everyone who is committed to making real change." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. "This work is far from over," Dr. Adams continued, "but we've made progress, and I am proud to be part of a movement that is challenging the status quo and fighting for a future where every patient is treated with the dignity and care they deserve." As Dr. Adams finished his speech, the audience rose to their feet, the applause filling the room with a sense of shared purpose. Ethan stood with them, his heart full as he watched Dr. Adams accept the recognition he so richly deserved. In the weeks that followed the award ceremony, Ethan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had started out as a man blinded by his own biases, unaware of the systemic injustices that existed in the world around him. But through his work with the coalition, and with the guidance of people like Dr. Adams and Maya Johnson, he had learned to see the world in a new light. He had learned that real change wasn't easy. It required sacrifice, persistence, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it was also the most important work he had ever done. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in his office, a knock came at the door. He looked up to see Dr. Adams standing in the doorway, a rare smile on his face. "Got a minute?" Dr. Adams asked. Ethan grinned. "For you?" "Always." Dr. Adams stepped inside and sat down across from Ethan, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about where we go from here." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You've got something in mind?" Dr. Adams nodded slowly. "I think we need to expand the coalition's work. The bias training programs are working, but there's still so much more to be done, especially in rural and underserved areas. I've been talking with Maya, and we think it's time to launch a new initiative." Ethan leaned forward, excitedly building in his chest. "Tell me more." Dr. Adams's eyes gleamed with purpose. "We want to focus on outreach, bringing healthcare equity programs to the communities that need them the most. We'll work with local clinics, train medical staff, and engage with community leaders to address the specific challenges they face." Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "I'm in. Whatever you need, I'm with you." Dr. Adams smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "I knew I could count on you." As they sat together discussing the future of their work, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had found his purpose, and he wasn't going to stop fighting for it. They had come a long way, but there was still so much more to do. Years later, the impact of the work Ethan and Dr. Adams had done together could be seen across the country. Hospitals had adopted bias training programs as part of their standard practices, and community clinics in underserved areas were receiving the funding and support they needed to provide equitable care to all patients. The Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition had grown into a national force, leading the charge for systemic change and serving as a beacon of hope for those who had once felt marginalized and forgotten. Ethan, now older and wiser, looked back on the journey with a sense of pride and humility. He had started out fighting to right his own wrongs, but along the way, he had discovered a cause that was bigger than himself, a cause that would continue long after he was gone. As he stood in front of a group of young healthcare leaders at a conference, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned, Ethan knew that the fight for equity wasn't over, but he also knew that the seeds of change had been planted and they were growing. "We all have a role to play in making the world a better place," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn, to grow, and to fight for what's right." The audience listened intently, and as Ethan finished his speech, he looked out at the faces of the next generation of leaders, the people who would carry on the work he had started. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Years later, the impact of the work Ethan and Dr. Adams had done together could be seen across the country. Hospitals had adopted bias training programs as part of their standard practices, and community clinics in underserved areas were receiving the funding and support they needed to provide equitable care to all patients. The Racial Equity in Healthcare Coalition had grown into a national force, leading the charge for systemic change and serving as a beacon of hope for those who had once felt marginalized and forgotten. Ethan, now older and wiser, looked back on the journey with a sense of pride and humility. He had started out fighting to right his own wrongs, but along the way, he had discovered a cause that was bigger than himself, a cause that would continue long after he was gone. As he stood in front of a group of young healthcare leaders at a conference, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned, Ethan knew that the fight for equity wasn't over, but he also knew that the seeds of change had been planted and they were growing. "We all have a role to play in making the world a better place," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn, to grow, and to fight for what's right." The audience listened intently, and as Ethan finished his speech, he looked out at the faces of the next generation of leaders, the people who would carry on the work he had started. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. If this story inspired you to take a stand against prejudice and fight for equality in healthcare, we invite you to be part of the movement. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one, where we highlight the fight for justice, change, and human dignity. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on the latest efforts to make the world a fairer place, one story at a time. Together, we can create lasting change. Hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, and share your thoughts on how we can build a more equitable world. Let's continue this journey together.